So I'll be sharing slides in just a moment. Now, I am absolutely excited about what we have in store today. It is hot off the press. Sharonda was integral in helping to design this. And when I think about hope and begin again, I first must acknowledge that I riffed the name off of Eddie Glaude's new book about James Baldwin, To Begin Again. And he says that to begin again, to do our first works over again, we must examine everything, right? And I think that where we are in our world right now, it's just an opportunity to recognize that we mustn't allow despair to get the last word, right? That hope and despair and disbelief does not coexist. So, with that, I'm curious if we can sort of do a chat bomb and I'll count down, 10 to 1. What is hope to you? So you'll have a second to think about it, right? But what is hope to you? What does it mean? All of these are absolutely correct in my perspective and opinion of what hope is. And some scientists and psychologists also believe that hope is something that is really hard to measure, right? Similar to what we think about when we say well-being and wellness, right? It's sort of subjective and it depends on the environment in which people are thriving or attempting to live that allows them to be well, right? So we know that hope in and of itself is also a causative energy, meaning that when it's felt, right? So it's felt, it causes certain reactions in our physiological being. And everything that you've put into the chat tells me that when hope is non-existent, when we cease to believe that the outcome is possible, if we're working with a family or we're working in a community or at a job, we may as well get off the case because families, some of us really value the need for others to keep that faith in us, even if we don't have it in ourselves, right? I know for a fact that I would not be sitting here today. And I'm just looking at the screen. I recall years ago, like emailing Kaylin O'Connor after 10 o'clock at night, put my son to bed, just trying to learn, like, what does all this stuff mean? Can I use this information here? And can I regurgitate it there and help me make sense of it? And it's individuals like her and some other friends, Sharonda and Dee, who deposit and who pour into me, check in on me, keep me sort of upbeat because they have hope in the outcome. Even if I don't know exactly what that outcome is, they maintain this level of belief that if we stay steadfast, and Jim McKay is another one, if we stay steadfast on this approach that the outcome is possible, we are instilling and spreading hope into other people. So that's why I consider it a causative energy. Now, today, what we'll do is think about like how we utilize hope, right? So the tone, sometimes we say, well, you know, I hope, right? I hope that he, she, they believe that that's possible, or the inflection that we use. So we even utilize hope in various ways. Sometimes it's doubtful, right? Yeah, one would hope, right? Like that. What's that, right? One would hope, right? That's sort of like disbelief. Yeah, right. I'll wait and see if it ever happens. I don't believe in that. Today, we are going to walk together. And what I mean by walk together, we are going to journey into the minds of a new creation. We're going to unpack what a process looked like for creative design, sort of a guide. It's not a toolkit, but it's a process and a guide to show leaders, practitioners, community organizers, those that work with kids, families, and communities, a way of investing in hope through equitable partnerships with families. So a few months ago, Sharon and I'll share my screens in just a moment. Sharon and I had an opportunity to invest in a 3-week sprint, and during that sprint, we began to challenge ourselves with the question of how might we build a post-COVID racially just future with families and communities. So, in partnership with Aaliyah Innovations and IDEO and some other courageous leaders that I will introduce you to in just a moment, we came up with a plan for you. And just in case we run out of time, I want us to be mindful that for those leaders in this space that would like to be a part of beta testing, right? So this is how fresh this is. Uh, if you want to be a part of beta testing this process with your teams and your groups, please include your email, or you could email Chloe, myself, or throw it in the chat, and we'll capture that. And you can actually help us on our relentless pursuit of evidence to say that this approach is indeed a hopeful approach and it works to build partnerships with families. So I'm going to walk you through slowly of what it is that we accomplish. Hopefully, we'll have some time for some small breakout. But if not, we'll just unmute and start having an open group conversation, right? We're very flexible in this space because we have hope that the outcome is possible. And here is where we come in with begin again with hope, right? That it is a causative action. So this is out of the voices, the experiences of families and leaders who have led systems. And what I'd like to do is introduce you to Dear Leaders. It's a resource of starting points for leaders in child welfare to bring family and community voice and power to system. Now, I know that some of us may not work specifically in child protection or child welfare, but we're pushing forward to even redefine what the welfare of children look like. So we're all a part of a system and obligated to provide a level of hope that will actually lead to the welfare, well-being, safety, and thriving for and with kids and families. So I could not do this alone, right? We have Sharonda Sullivanoff on the call, who helped design, Lexi Gruber, myself, Tara O'Connor from Wisconsin, Francesca LaRue, Margaret Munns, Shenandoah Shefflow, and Francine Ferguson. So we want to really give a big thanks because this was a collaborative effort here, and we caught them in still face there. So Sharonda, I do apologize for that, but I really like that smile there. It is a hopeful smile. So here we are. This is where we began as we thought about that question. We thought about what needed to occur, and then there's these levels of listening. The levels of listening is what we attended to throughout our time together to begin cultivating this prototype that we'll unpack today. So as we began to think about an equitable, racially just post-COVID partnership with families, we realized that we have habits, we have judgments, we have opinions of one another. So what we want to do is we usually download and reconfirm our old opinions and habits. So we listen often from the outside, right? Noticing difference. We want to begin to listen with an open mind, disconfirming and accepting and embracing new information, new data that will get us to this authenticity we desire with one another and also with our families and community. Listening from within was critical to the process because this gives us the empathic, right? The emotional connection, the heart connection that we often leave out of this work in seeing through another person's eyes. That is much different than saying, let me walk in someone else's shoes, because we know that that is impossible. So we have an ideology and a worldview. And in this process, with an open heart and connecting from that space, right, through hope, we're able to at least sit back and see what another person may see, right? We may not experience it, we may not feel it, but at least we're honoring that, and that breeds connection. And we began to generate from a source of generative from the future, like what might things look like. I'm learning that the word might in a question connotes that it is indeed possible. So how do we then connect to our emerging future whole, right? Shifting our identity. And again, this is another way to frame it from theory U, right? Past patterns. We're downloading, we're suspending, we're redirecting things that we've been taught and learned along the way in this life across the continuum, whether it be about people's otherness, their worldviews, our own. And we let go of some of those things and begin to presence with people, be with people. As we do that, we allow things to come to us. And this was what the process was like. We often think about innovation and creativity in this linear fashion, but this is quite different. We were able to, once we connected with each other, we were able to crystallize and then prototype what we embodied. And here today, this is the first time that you'll see us actually performing. This is that fresh. So I'm going to invite you to understand that since we asked ourselves a question about a post-COVID racially just future with kids, families, and community, we had to understand the history of racism. So I won't go through a history lesson here, but I really want to put it in context, because I believe that things that are not decontextualized sort of begin to look like culture, behavior, personality, and communities. And that gives us an opportunity to label things as such, how we see the world. As you can see from this timeline, and again, from 1607 or 1619, depending upon where you start your education, I'll just say that for 248 years, which is 63% of our history here in these United States, beginning from 1619 to present, that's 248 years our ancestors, yours included, lived in an environment where it was legal chattel slavery, right? For another 100 years, if we look at Reconstruction through 1964, 65 passage of civil rights, we were in another 100 years of Jim Crow. And that tells us, good people, that there is hope, of course, but that tells us that we are only 13% of our country's history out of legalized chattel slavery. So to say that in another way, our ancestors were in much longer than we've been out. So we have a ways to go when it comes to building racially just and equitable relationships with people who are different than us, right? But it all starts with how our history began. Again, those downloading those patterns, listening to what your voices are saying. How are we setting a container today? And today we're setting a container that is fundamental to the work, because we're building on the platform and foundation of understanding the historical context of systems of inequities and how that context creates othering people, breaks down a sense of belonging, minimizes our ability, I would say, to transmit hope in the way that we want to transmit hope. And I hope that makes sense, because our history often shapes our culture. Our culture shapes our identity. Again, not a history lesson here, but power and economics are the churners of this particular engine of systems of oppression and inequities. So we deal with, in the internal mechanism, we deal with a lot of biases, privilege, internalized oppression, and superiority that often shows up in our systems. Now, many of us work in nonprofit, right? Foundations, philanthropy. When we think about the legacy of those institutions, we must begin to understand what occurrences happened that allowed us to remove ourselves from community and move into more of a therapeutic, evidence-driven, policy-dictated way of being with families. And how is it that as a clinician, a social worker, a child protection worker, a case manager, and a supervisor, that we can make decisions about people's lives, measure their well-being, understand what they need, prescribe those needs without ever shaking a hand with them, without ever sitting in conversation and presencing with them. Our policies have allowed us to do that. And there is part of the breakdown. Again, there is hope. So these are things that me and my colleagues really elevated and brought to the space, because we wanted to understand how can we do this in a way that gets us to sort of equity practice with families. So again, the phases of equity practice, as you can see on your screen, and I won't go through all of them, but there was a level of familiar dysfunction in the very beginning of these conversations, because obviously, as you can see from the images that I showed you, we were a multicultural group of individuals. And there's often this vibe of tokenism when we're talking about parents, community members with lived experience. So there's a need for us to feel as if we have to fit into an already inclusive, meaning white inclusive only space, right? So we began to make an explicit commitment to what we wanted to work on, how we wanted to prototype. And ultimately, and again, this was a 3-week sprint. So imagine what will happen if you have 60, 90 days with families and community. We saw automatically culture shift began with our group. These are all predictable phases of equity practice. And once we got there, we see that we were actually cultivating something that was formed out of relational trust. So here we have it. So I'm going to frame this sketch for you in a way. This is out of the minds and the thinking of individuals who invested their hope, their time, and their treasures into this work. So child welfare agencies cannot meaningfully collaborate with families because they don't trust the system. These are truths, right? So hope doesn't mean that there isn't any tension, right? We have to acknowledge truth in order to instill and transmit hope. Trust is a relationship challenge, not a process challenge. Task lists do not solve a relationship challenges. There could be, this isn't for everyone, caution or warning. In order for this to work for you, you must already believe that, again, back to the hope, right? For example, the best solutions lie with the closest to the challenge, right? Proximity is key in building hope with families. That you know that you could not or should not do this alone, that you recognize your staff are the healers, some kind of, before you get started, list of questions or prerequisites, right? How might we share in the burden and pain, parentheses, of the trauma we've caused and of white supremacy culture marginalizing group of people? Well, how might we share is we're vulnerable, we're honest, and we have a sort of a guide to work with. We asked our families and our partners to utilize their senses, right? Their senses. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a minute. And we came up with this poem. What might it feel like, look like, sound like, be like, taste like in a post-COVID, racially just, equitable partnership with families? And here's what we harvested. Our members said that it would feel like a morning breeze from an open balcony, the relief of sitting down after standing for a long time. It feels like visiting the sweet old school nurse, deep conversation with someone who gets you, Saturday pancakes and no schedule, unhurried going to a friend's house to share what is happening in my life, a priceless moment, a child lovingly looking at their parents, belonging, warm honey, my community, a meal so full of flavor, you must ask, what did you put in this? Awe, healing, truth, the golden time of day. Every person met with a loving prospect of unlimited possibilities. Some of what you put in the chat is just that, right? So the unlimited possibility. This is hope. in action. And what I want to share is a little more of what we decided to say to leaders, some things that we felt leaders needed to hear as they embark upon investing, spreading, and building partnerships filled with hope with communities and families. Dear leaders, we're so glad you're here. We know you share our intention of working closely with families. We also know you hold power over families in the system, a system that incentivizes separating over strengthening them. This dynamic makes it difficult to build relationships with families that are respectful, transparent, and non tokenizing. Building these relationships requires resources, a shared foundation of trust, new ways of thinking that butt up against the very purpose of this system's inception. We know the problem is enormous, but that doesn't mean change and hope isn't possible. As a leader, you sit at a unique intersection, bridging communities, families, staff, and levers of influence within the system. You hold power. By sharing that power with families, we can change the system. We recognize change can't happen overnight, but we do know change starts with small steps. As a leader, it's not about having the answers. It's about having the courage to bring people together to move towards the discovery of what's possible and believing a different future is possible. Again, back to what you said hope meant to you. Possibilities, future, discovery, believing that we can do this together. Our communities depend on it. Our families depend on it. Our children depend on it. The most important thing is to begin. And Antoinette Carroll reminds us that, like all systems of oppression, inequality, and inequity are by design, therefore can be redesigned. So where do you begin, right? So this is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. This is where we begin to understand how to prototype and unpack ways of building hope with communities. So we developed, through our prototyping, 5 principles. I'll unpack most of them and then hopefully have time to engage in a conversation. Shifting systems begins with the mindsets and behaviors of the people working within the system. To authentically engage, build trusted relationships, and design with families, these 5 principles should guide that shift. Context, compassion, change, consistency, and collaboration. Now, we know those are value statements, but we took it a step further and ran with how does it show up in practice. So we're going to give a few focus areas and also some indicators to what it looks like. To give you a little more insight into our minds as we began to prototype and develop this, we have an anatomy of content that we looked at. And we want to encourage individuals to think about where we are now, a future state, and a starting point, right? So each principle, again, this is a guide, a framework. Each principle has its own set of focus area, and let's dive a little bit deeper into what that looks like. Context. So let's unpack context. Here we have some quotes from families who are part of the design process. I won't read them all. I'll just pull a couple. We must be aware of child welfare's history, of what we've done to Black and brown families, right? Again, back to that timeline, understanding the context of where we are is critically important, because I'm going to repeat it. A decontextualized experience often looks like loss of hope, hopeless, behavior, personality, culture, environment. And we often utilize those decontextualized messages without interrogating them for validity. And I see a few in the chat. Yes, the slides will be made available. And there's a caveat. We want to see if you want to be a part of the beta testing. So we'll get to that in a moment. I'm trying to sell something, really not sell, just spread hope, as Bob Siggy would say. I'm trying to spread hope. And this is a way that we can begin to operationalize spreading hope. So this is the context piece. And as we think about those 5 principles again, uh, we're asking leaders to make an active commitment to truth and reconciliation. So we recognize that the work does not exist in isolation. So you, in context of your position, reckons with the history of harm and trauma perpetuated by the system while simultaneously building toward reimagined futures. Some of us have been indoctrinated and trained in a way that says if we trace and also acknowledge the negative side of our United States, that's staying in the problem. Well, we have to understand the problem before we begin to try to solve the problem. And what we're asking leaders to think about is truth and reconciliation. Requires leaning into the work from a place of humility. So some of the focus areas we've given 3. Please feel free, if you embrace the approach, feel free to identify your own focus areas utilizing the content of anatomy, the anatomy of content. So one of the focus areas here for context is identifying and deepening our understanding of the dimensions of cultural biases and also racism, right? Resourcing our organization with racial justice and anti-racism resources and learning opportunities specific to your institution. In this space, we were talking about child welfare, right? And this is one of the hardest things here and something that we rarely see. Many communities who are under siege by goods and services feel that there is very little power, but there's power in acknowledging harm. Most communities, especially communities of color, are not naive enough to believe that just by instilling and investing in hope, things are going to miraculously change. It is indeed a start. So let's not discount the experiences of communities because an acknowledgement of the harm done goes a very, very long way. And it's not always about tangible monetary reconciliation. The other context is compassion. So we have the best laid plans. If you're not well, it is tough to execute, right? So this is about you. How are you within your organization staying well, right? So compassion. So we're asking leaders to actively make a commitment to prioritize psychological safety and well-being internal their institutions and with their families, right? So compassion leads with putting people first. Compassionate leaders model not only trauma-informed and healing-informed behavior, but also race-informed behavior, because I feel that we cannot consider ourselves trauma-informed if we're not race-informed and informed about these United States of America. So compassion, prioritizing, right? Making psychological safety and well-being a priority within your organization, because what happens internally manifests itself externally. And one of the focus areas here is supporting staff and families on their psychological safety and well-being, modeling asset-based language rather than deficit-based language when referring to families. Back to the patterns of behavior. Our systems have continually allowed us to utilize negative language with families without any accountability whatsoever. Many of us are moving away from that, and that is an awesome thing to see because it makes a huge difference. Change is the other. We can only take people to as far as we've come, right? So that's critically important for us to realize that often we try to do things, to model things, to partner in ways that are we're not accustomed to. Simply put, right? We have to possess what we want to transmit. We cannot give anything away that we don't have ourselves, right? You need to be willing to do the work and not just collect a paycheck. If it's not part of your discussion to even consider your own role in causing harm, then that might be part of the problem. And these are quotes from individuals who've experienced systems as professionals and also who've been impacted by the system of oppression. Change, growth, and self-transformation. So when I look at these focus areas, vulnerability, reflecting on how we are minimizing violence and harm in the system, or playing a role in, or how we're playing a role, I should say, in perpetuating it. Analyzing data, right? That four-letter word can get us derailed. So, what kind of data? Where does it come from? Is it just the quantitative data? Are we talking to communities about how we can together improve future engagements with one another? Now, I bet you're wondering, okay, well, that was like where we begin, but how do we do it, right? Again, that this is not a toolkit. This is just a guide. So, what we want you to notice in your work is who you are, right? Who you are, what is your work, and why do you do this work? It's critically important for you as an individual to reflect upon that. And when we come up with deeper answers, we realize that there are various reasons why we do the work. But understand your own identity in the context of a system, because often it's hard to tease away how are systems responsible for negative outcomes when people make individual choices, right? Well, we as people, we comprise the system, and we often uphold policies that we haven't interrogated. So it's up to us to understand that we bring certain things to the workplace. So our power, how are we respectfully situated relative to opportunity and also institutional power? What is our situation? And also, what is the equity challenge, right? What is the challenge that I'm having? Is it othering? Is it race? Is it sex? Is it gender? Is it behavior? Is it environment? What is it that I'm challenged with? This goes back to creating that safety, that bravery within your institution with communities that allow you to understand the context in which we live, work, thrive, and play. Partnership. Given the above, how can we create a partnership that is liberating? Right? We hear that word a lot, liberation, right? For all, right? What does it truly mean? What are the indicators of a liberated environment? Well, some would say that all voices are heard and valued. Well, that's a belief, but do we really practice that? Are all voices heard and valued, or are the voices that are a little more polished, right? Heard and valued? Are the voices that are a little more white heard and valued? Are the voices that are raw? Are the voices that are high? Are the voices that are experiencing episodes of mental illness? Are those voices liberated, brave, and free in spaces, right? So we have to think about our intention when it comes to and the power of who we are allowed to invite to spaces. That so that what we design generates increased equity, right? So all voices, all experiences, without fear, without hesitation, without activated biases. Right? Those are things that we're asking you when you begin to spread hope in a very concrete way to notice and reflect. That is indeed the liberatory design. And so we're asking three things of you as you begin to think about how change starts, right? So we know that working with IDEO and ALEA and our partners, Change starts with asking ourselves the right questions or different questions, right? So we begin this process, this generative process, by reflecting on the current state. So, what is our work? What are we doing? How are we doing in regards to whatever focus area we have thought about, right? Context, compassion, change, collaboration. How are we doing there? How are we currently modeling the mindsets and behaviors in regard to a said principle and also focus area? This is where we begin to co-design a vision, a future vision with community, right? So how will we interact differently with families, right? I wonder if we ask ourselves that question enough, right? What should those experiences feel like for and with families? And the values piece is critically important, because as I'm sure you're what's resonating with you right now, hopefully, is that this is all relational and values driven work that we're talking about. And so we take these lofty philosophical thoughts and we actually put some tangible actions to show how they come to life as we begin to invest and spread hope with one another. So, what values will drive the impact of what we hope to create? And then co-create a starting point, right? Just think about your touch points. Where do we begin? How do we see it through? Who must be involved? How are we holding ourselves accountable? It's not just the parent contact. It's not just showing up for court. It's not just returning a call within 48 hours. How are we in community with people and giving them power to help guide, shape, and drive our systems to the place we want them to be? And this is where you come in. So I've given you an opportunity here. So I drafted an aspiration for you to build hope with communities and families. Broad vision, right? Just broad vision. And what I'd like for you to do is to think about the first two questions. What actions are you currently taking to prioritize this? And what might need to change to make this a priority? So as we're getting back into the space, just wanted to give you just a heads up that there are two other components. The designing a future vision is the space where we begin to get into our senses, right? Feel, sound, smells, taste, and then we make a commitment to the work. And the co-creating a starting point are the two that we were unable to really dive deep into today. I'm going to quote, thank you all for sharing, and my apologies that we weren't able to get to everyone's experiences and voice. So I'm going to quote a colleague, and I think she actually appears as one of the co-designers. And Shen has taught me that, again, if we realize a few fundamental elements about trauma, we may have an opportunity to build healthier relationships with those that we think are traumatized. And it goes above and beyond recognizing our own, right? Our own stuff, right? Since Ferletti and Kaiser, took the fun out of dysfunction in the 90s, then we're like all over the place, right? But she says that trauma typically happens in relationship. So therefore, it's also healed in relationship. Sometimes we treat our families like the shaken Sprite, right? We don't want to open it too fast because, it's going to just fizz on us. Some of us got a little skills that, your grandmama taught you. Just pat the top a little bit and let it settle down before we just go right into it, because we know it's explosive. And some of us just say, I'm not even going to chance it, right? And it reminds me of a book that we were seeing flying off the shelves pre-COVID. It's that little orange book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a You Know What, right? We all saw that in airports and we read it ourselves, but there was some valuable nuggets in that book. And then there's also a piece that I'm challenged with when it comes to hope. And that was the notion of sparing our you know what's, right? Like choosing when to really give a, right? But and I equate that to some of how we treat our families and our staff who are different than us. Like we spare and reserve transmitting hope to those that we feel are more like us, safer, right? Our affinity group, and those things come out of the subconscious. So my charge is that if we want hope to be contagious and widespread, let's not spare it, right? Let's not reserve it, right? We have to give the goodness away. And that becomes saturated in our institutions, in our beings, and families will begin to feel what's very difficult for us to measure, especially coming from a clinical, therapeutic, evidence-based perspective where we have a lot of checklists, box, and measurements that we need to adhere to. All to say, I challenge you to think about that. And one thing that you will do, like in the next 48 hours, to challenge the way you see anybody that is different than you are. You have autonomy on how you choose to do that. But do that in 48 hours. I hope that this was impactful, some, right? Engaging, and I'll follow up with Maggie, get those names, see how I can rapidly get you all connected to some beta testing, and we'll move forward from then. So until we speak, see, meet again, stay well, take good care of yourselves and others. Take good care.